Okay, everybody, how you doing this morning? This is Mr. G, your instructor for American History 2. Today we're going to have a brief overview of the Civil War. I'm sure that you have downloaded your textbooks. They are on Moodle. If you have not been able to see them, then just let me know, and I'll just go ahead and send you a direct link, and that way you can download it. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to have to wait for that answer so that everybody can see. Um, I do this a lot. Normally I set up my green screen behind me, but I have a couple of lights that are out, so you're just going to have to look at my ugly face throughout the whole lecture. Miss Willoughby, how are you? I did receive your email. For those of you that are a little apprehensive about this course, you might want to ask other people that have taken me before. I'm not that difficult. I just request that you do everything on time. Okay, so we're going to start now. I'm going to do it a brief overview. I don't know if a lot of you had this in American History 1, but it's just a brief overview of the Civil War and why it was fought. So I'm going to go ahead and begin. We're not going to wait for anybody else to come in, but you do get credit for your attendance here this morning. Thank you for being here. The North versus the South, what were the advantages and disadvantages between the North and the South in 1861 when the war actually started? Now, before the war actually started, there was a lot of arguments over states' rights. The South didn't want the North to tell them what to do. And every time a new state would come into the Union, they'd have a free state and they'd have to have a slave state. So the balance would be equal in Congress. And so the South was just like, you're not going to tell us what to do here in the South. Now, the one thing that the South had over the North, was that they brought in 80% of the income, the revenue, because of cotton and in turn slavery. So in 1860, there was a new party called the Republican Party, and they ran a candidate by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, basically said, his primary function was to keep the Union together. It had nothing, he wasn't either way, as far as slavery was concerned at that time. He said in a speech, and I'm paraphrasing here, if I could keep the Union together without freeing one slave, I would do it. If I could keep the Union together and free all the slaves, I would do it. So his primary function was to keep the Union together. That was it. How he was going to do it didn't exactly come out the way he wanted to. In 1860, he ran for president, and the South warned the North, if you run Abraham Lincoln, because we know that he's for abolition, we're going to secede from the Union. So that's what happened. They seceded from the Union. But what I want to make perfectly clear about the American Civil War is the Union was the aggressor. The North was the aggressor. They invaded the South first. They drew first blood. So that's basically, a lot of people say, oh, well, the South was this and the South was that. It wasn't just about slavery. It was about money, of course. Always inform all my students. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, Jen, I'll do it. So it wasn't about money, okay? And so what happens is, Charleston, I'm sorry, I didn't see the first name. I apologize. Please accept my apology with all due respect. So what happens is the South secedes from the Union, and the North, Lincoln puts together a force. This is 1861. It all starts in February 1861. The first state to lead the Union was South Carolina. And South Carolina said, look, we're not going to put up with this. We're going to live our own way. And they formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as the president. But what were the advantages at the beginning of the war? Well, the total population was in the North. 71% of the population of the country was in the North. Bank deposits, the North had kind of like gone through a mini industrial revolution, so their factories were producing, and the South was still an agrarian economy, which means they relied on agriculture. They had more factories, of course. Now, if you look at cotton was the only basic type of commodity that the South had, that they were ahead of the North. And the reason why they had that was because slavery and the cotton gin that was invented in the previous century, in 1794, I believe, by Eli Whitney, allowed more cotton to be produced. Well, anyway, if you look at food crops, North was bigger because of the breadbasket colonies. And horses, they had more horses. They had more, the South had more donkeys and mules, of course, because of the types of work that was done with those. And railroad tracks, because they had money. The South wasn't spending a lot of money on industrialization because they liked the way life was. And that was their biggest downfall. But the North had a lot of advantages. And if we look at the populations, there were more slaves in the South than there were in the North. So if we would have armed the slaves and promised them some type of freedom, they probably would have gone to fight for the Confederacy. But we didn't do that because it was illegal to have slaves own weapons. But later on, we in the South, I say we in the South, we allowed them to carry weapons. There were black soldiers in the Confederacy. Okay, don't let anybody tell you differently. They weren't just in the North. There were black soldiers in the Confederacy. So when you look at the population of these states, it was the slave population was larger, but slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a regular person back then. They weren't count for the purposes of representation. They were not considered a whole person. All right, so if you have one body, that's only 3/5 of a body. You see, so these figures could be off a little bit. And if you look at the railroad lines, you'll see that they were mostly in the North. The South, like I said, spent very little money on industrialization. It was more of let's grow more cotton. That's our staple. That's what we need. I mean, if you look at photos from the old South, you'll see even in New Orleans, because New Orleans was a big port. And that's how we got things to Europe. In fact, when the Civil War came along, the North had a plan called the Anaconda Plan. They were going to strangle all of the southern ports. So when you look at this map, you look at all the railroads they're coming out of the North. They're coming out of the big port cities: Boston, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, America. All these port cities. That's where most of the railroads were because they spent money on industrialization. And this is what the Union and the Confederacy looked like in 1871. And you'll see that there's a lot of territories that hadn't been settled yet. That would come later when the railroads went through. California became a state in 1849 for one reason and one reason only. They struck gold, and the government wanted their cut, so they allowed them into the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia wasn't a state until Virginia was split up in 1863. And of course, you have these border states, Kentucky and Missouri, and a lot of bloodshed went on there between anti-slavery and pro-slavery factions. Men present for duty in the Civil War, there wasn't a lot of them in the South. We did not have... one thing I try to stress is that there was a lot of pride in states back then. A lot of these units from the Confederacy, like you had the 4th Kansas, the 4th Louisiana, the 1st Louisiana Regiment, they were divided by states. So there wasn't a lot of cohesion in the Confederate Army, but there was only 0.1% of the Confederate Army, the soldiers in the Confederate Army, that owned slaves. And I always pose this question to my students. Well, if they were only 0.1% owned slaves, the other 9/10, what were they fighting for? They were fighting for pride, is what they were fighting for, of their states. We had been invaded by a foreign invader, the Union. So that's one of the reasons why we went to war. We actually didn't want to go to war. We wanted to try and end it peacefully, but it didn't end peacefully because the North had invaded us. When Lincoln came into power, he called for 75,000 infantrymen. Okay? So when they went to war, the Confederacy was woefully unprepared. But you got to remember something too. The generals on both sides, they all went to school together. They all went to West Point. They all went to some of them went to Annapolis, which was the Naval Academy. So they learned the same tactics. So that's why the war took so long, because when one side would use a tactic in battle, the other side would counter it with the tactics that they both learned. So that's why it was so devastating. This is the Ohio Military Service. This is just an example that shows you the amount of men who, from what particular type of labor that they did. Generally, if you were a clerk or a professional, you became an officer. Back then, you could buy a commission in the military, and that's what a lot of these guys did, because they didn't want to be with the grunts in the front line. They were the first ones to actually get killed, so they didn't do that. This is soldiers' occupations in North and South. You can see farmers were the most part. And this goes back to the Revolutionary War. We did have a standing army. In the Confederacy, we had a lot of troops, a lot of officers that had retired. They first had to resign their commissions from the Union Army before they took a commission in the Confederate Army, because you can't fight for two armies at one time. In actuality, Robert E. Lee, who was the general for the South, the Army of Northern Virginia, was offered command of the Union Army at the outset of the war, and he turned it down. Reason being is he said he's not going to turn his sword against Virginia. He wasn't going to fight against Virginia, which was his home state. So if you look at these a lot, they're mechanics, they're laborers, businessmen, professionals, and others. The war was seen by a lot of people as gaining glory and fame, and the war was not fought for that reason. It was fought for sustenance. Near the end of the war, which we'll talk about, because this is going to be Reconstruction 1, and then Wednesday's going to be Reconstruction 2, and then I'll give you a reading assignment in your book. The tests are not difficult; they're multiple choice, fill in a blank, and true and false. So you can't go wrong. So when you look at these professional people, they wanted to come back to their careers, so they figured, hey, I'm going to buy a commission, and I'm going to go ahead and serve, and I'm going to command. Well, a lot of these guys didn't know anything about military tactics. They were what's known as political generals. They were appointed there because they knew somebody, and they wanted all this glory and come home with medals and things of that nature. So a lot of them joined for the wrong reasons. Immigrants were a big part of the armies. We had a European battalion down here from Louisiana that was mostly Italians. And, when you look at all of these states up here in Minnesota and Wisconsin, these are mostly Nordic immigrants, people from like Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, places of that nature. But we did have people that fought who were immigrants in both armies. The Union Army, I believe, had an Irish regiment that fought with them. They believed in the cause. That's why. The leaders of the Confederacy were President Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens. When I first saw this photograph, I thought it was a little kid of Alexander Stephens at first. Jefferson Davis was the former Secretary of War under Buchanan. He went to West Point. He fought in the Mexican-American War. I believe he was governor of Mississippi. He was from Mississippi. He lived in a place called Beauvoir, which is still on the Gulf Coast. I think one of the hurricanes blew it down. The originals there, they have a presidential library. He was the only president of the Confederacy. There was never another president. He was there for 4 years. And these are the two leaders of the Confederacy. The Confederate White House was first located in Montgomery, Alabama, and then it was moved to Richmond, Virginia, which is just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., so the capitals were really close to each other. And in the closing days of the war, the capital was overrun by Union troops. This was the Confederate seal. Another thing that students have to realize is each side believes they're right. Their cause is just, and they believe they're going to win. So, and with God's help. Now, a lot of times when you look at the South, they justified slavery by using the Bible. Don't ask me how, they just did. And so when the Confederacy went to war, they used that same type of justification to fight the Union. So this was their seal, and at the bottom it says, with God as our vindicator. We're going to be right. God's going to judge us correct in our cause. The northern view of Jefferson Davis was, if you look at it this way, basically they thought he was a horse's behind. One is the picture that he looked like. If you turn the picture upside down, it looks like a donkey on this side. He was a fool for going to war against the North, especially when the North had all the industrialization behind them. Overview of the North Civil War strategy. Remember I mentioned the Anaconda Plan. That was this right here. And Louisiana was part of that plan because we had a major port city. New Orleans was a major port city. So we had to do that because, they had to do that because if you strangle the ports, the cotton can't get out and the South can't make any money because they pitted that one particular staple to their economy. Excuse me one second. Let me get some water. This is the second lecture I did today. So, okay. So it was the Anaconda Plan. They were going to strangle the ports. And New Orleans was a port city. And if you look here, you'll see that there was an arrow going here, and this was supposed to strangle all the ports. But they had what they call blockade runners. These were really fast ships that brought in goods to the South. Near the end of the war, they were saving women's urine to make gunpowder. They were using rose bushes for kneading, thread needles to sew. They made socks. The South was being starved out. In fact, in around, near the latter part of the war, they were just running out of things, and they had to use sawdust to make bread. And when they made sawdust to make bread, it was very gritty, but it worked. They had nothing to eat. Vicksburg, Mississippi was surrounded in July of 1863, and they eating rats. I mean, they didn't have any food. I mean, they were surrounded, and the Union surrounded them. And this battle took place around the same time as Gettysburg in July of 1863, and it turned things around. And General Ulysses S. Grant was the one that captured Vicksburg. He was winning victories while other Union generals were losing victories because they were political generals. Let's see here. This basically shows the Anaconda Plan in a cartoon. Excuse me. And it gives you a general idea as to what the Union plan was. These were Lincoln's generals. Let's see if I can bring some of them out here. Yeah, that was Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers. That was Irwin. Let me see who that was. Let me see. Irwin McDowell. The point here being is that President Lincoln went through 7 generals to find somebody to beat Robert E. Lee. They couldn't beat him. He was just that good of a tactician. Finally, they did because the Southern Army was like dying of attrition. McClellan was a big blowhard general, and in fact, he kind of disobeyed Lincoln, kind of sloughed him off. Well, that's your commander-in-chief. You know, you can't slough him off. And McClellan ran against President Lincoln in the 1864 election as a Democratic candidate, and he lost. I mean, Lincoln wiped the floor with him. This shows you this is Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet. These were all his top generals: Stonewall Jackson, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Jeb Stuart, James Longstreet, and George Pickett. This gentleman right here, Nathan Bedford Forrest actually organized the Ku Klux Klan after the war was over in 1867 in Pulaski, Tennessee. He organized it as a social club for ex-veterans, but it was very racist. And when it became too violent, even he quit. Stonewall Jackson was killed in 1862. James Longstreet would later become like a military figure here in New Orleans. Jeb Stuart survived the war, George Pickett survived the war, and Robert E. Lee survived the war. But he died in 1870 of a heart attack, believe it or not. He was the greatest commander, I believe, this nation ever produced, along with George S. Patton. And nobody really lately that I can think of. But Robert E. Lee was an excellent commander. He went into a battle one time, and he got surrounded, and he was outnumbered. And what he did was he took a lot of long shots is what he did, and that's what made him so successful. And what he did was he split his army in two, attacked in both directions, and they got out. That's just how good of a soldier he was. He was actually in command of a Marine Corps detachment that surrounded John Brown at Harper's Ferry and took John Brown alive so that he would stand trial for treason and insurrection. But John Brown was hanged because of it. Anyway, the first Battle of Bull Run was known as First Manassas. Now, what happened was when these armies met, they didn't think that the war was going to last anything more than 6 weeks. So people were coming to the battle in carriages with champagne and picnic baskets. They thought it was going to be this lovely little battle. And the Union got routed. The Confederacy beat them badly. And there were continued Confederate victories throughout the war up until about 1864 when it started to turn around. But the first battle of Bull Run, First Manassas, each side had their own name. Was a Confederate rout. They routed the Union troops. There was these new weapons that came out that were called the ironclads, and the Monitor and the Merrimack met in 1862, and this is what the Monitor looked like. One of the pictures that has cannonball shots in it all over the place. It was a wooden hull with iron on top of it, and it kind of sat low in the water, so you couldn't see it that much. But the Monitor and the Merrimack were two of these ironclads that clashed. The Monitor, they just raised it, as a matter of fact. They found it and they raised it. Merrimack, I'm not sure what happened to it, but I believe it was destroyed in a storm, went down in a storm. At the time, you can, if there was a draft, you could buy your way out of serving. You could buy a substitute. A lot of people would do this for a living. They would go from one town, sign up, get $200, go to another town, get $200. $200 was a lot of money back then, and it's a lot of money now, believe it or not. Said by the man who has $1 in his wallet. Okay, trust me, I don't carry cash. But you could buy a substitute to take your place. And this was mostly rich guys that would do that. They would buy somebody to go sign up for them and go fight. This is the war in the East, 1861, 1862. The South had racked up a lot of victories. This is the first time we see the instances of trench warfare, which we'll talk about later during World War I. The Battle of Antietam had 23,000 casualties, dead and wounded, on September 17, 1862. It was the bloodiest single day of the war. In one day, 23,000 casualties. We wouldn't see casualties like this until we got to World War I during the Battle of the Somme in July 1st of 1916. We'll talk about that later, much later. In 1862, the end of 1862, Lincoln realized the Union was not doing well in the war. They were losing manpower. And Stephen Douglas went to President Lincoln and he said, look, if the North is fighting to liberate these slaves, why don't we give them something to fight for? So in December of 1862, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, what is the Emancipation Proclamation? What it does is it frees all the slaves in the states that are at war with the Union, not the whole nation. That's important, okay? Not the whole nation, just in those states that were at war with the United States. So in January of 1863, January 1st, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Again, I'm going to repeat this. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all slaves. It only freed those in territories or states that were at war with the United States, predominantly the Confederacy. So what about the rest of the country? We'll get to that a little bit later when we talk about Reconstruction. And there he was, a portrait of him holding the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Southern view of emancipation, this is a Southern political cartoon, and they basically demonized Lincoln for doing it. But, you know, I mean, what do you expect? Slavery was part of their economy. And what happened was a lot of slaves that escaped became soldiers in the Union Army. If you remember a movie that was made back in 1989 called Glory, it was about one of these regiments, the 54th Massachusetts, and it's a true story. The script was written based upon the letters that were written by the commander of that unit, a man by the name of Robert Gould Shaw, whose parents were abolitionists. And he led these men into battle. He said they need to get the same pay as white troops and things of that nature. So it was, you know, give them something to fight for. And Stephen Douglas was correct. It inadvertently changed the course of the war. Once they were not using former slaves for slave labor within the Union Army, when they got to fight, is when the war started to turn. Here is a poster, recruiting poster for the 54th Massachusetts. One of the first Congressional Medal of Honor winners was a guy named Johnson, I believe, from the 54th Massachusetts, that was wounded twice in battle and carried the American flag. Never let it hit the ground. He didn't get the medal until 30 years later, but, you know, I mean, he was still exhibited this bravery. African Americans in Civil War battles across the United States. This PowerPoint's going to go up under, I believe it's already there, under the chapter on Reconstruction. Like I said, this is Reconstruction Part 1 because I want to give a brief overview of the Civil War. And black troops would go into occupied territories and they would free slaves. And these slaves would follow these armies. And again, these armies had to feed them. It was a strain, but they believed it was worth it. These were extensive legislation that was passed without the South in Congress. I'm not going to really hold you responsible for anything except this one, the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1863, the war in the West, that wasn't necessarily out west. It was in the Mississippi River Valley, and New Orleans was part of that campaign. Vicksburg was surrounded in a siege, and every once in a while the Union Army would lob shells into Vicksburg. It was on the Mississippi River, so it wasn't that difficult to park ships out front, in front of Vicksburg, and bombard them. And they eventually capitulated in July of 1863. The Union Army was under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant. Gettysburg was an important battle, and I'll tell you why. The South believed in, this cotton, and they were shipping it overseas and into Europe. The Queen at the time, who was Victoria, believed that the South held an advantage, and the South wanted a foreign power to come over and help them. And Gettysburg was going to be the defining battle as to whether that was going to happen. It was the only Confederate invasion of the North, and it ended disastrously for the South. For the South. The South invaded the North. Robert E. Lee took his army of Northern Virginia and marched to Gettysburg and met the Union Army there. From July 1st through July 3rd, it was a very bloody battle. There's a battlefield there. Parts of it are being lost to developers, which as an historian I think is a crying shame, but that's what happens. And this will show you the movements of the Confederate Army prior to the battle and during the battle, if you're interested in that sort of thing. The Gettysburg casualties were, the troop strength was 50,000. Killed was over 6,000 Americans. I'm saying that because they are Americans, even though they fought in the Union Army and the Confederate Army, they were Americans. Wounded, look at the wounded, incredible. Captured or missing, and total losses for both sides. So the South basically lost little over half their strength at this one particular battle, and Robert E. Lee left Pennsylvania and never attempted a northern invasion again. So it was a decisive Union victory, even though they lost a lot of troops. In 1863, the North initiates a draft, and people didn't like that. Before it was volunteer, now it was a draft, and there were several draft riots all over the country because people didn't want to join the army. They were seeing people coming back without arms, legs, some of them without lower jaws, believe it or not. There were Irish immigrants coming into New York City all the time who were being recruited for the army. Some of them were forced into it. There were blacks in New York City that were recruited into the Union Army. There were draft riots from July 13th through the 16th in 1863, and they basically said, I'm not going. A lot of them said that they were not going to fight for the African Americans. They were not going to risk their life for freedom. For them, they weren't going to do it. So there were draft riots, and they were mercilessly and quickly put down when that occurred. The New York City draft riots, these are photos. You can see the city was almost burned to the ground, and they're beating a young black man in this illustration, and that's what it was like. They didn't feel, the prejudice wasn't just in the South, ladies and gentlemen. It was in the North too. All right, it was all over the country, and they did not want to fight for, slaves' freedom. Give me another cause, I'll fight for that. Then they bring up, fight for your country. Well, sometimes that's just not enough, especially in a civil war. There was what they call a pogrom against blacks. They were hanging them and lynching them in the streets and shooting them because a lot of people in New York believed that it was their fault that these riots had started in the first place. And if the Union was fighting for slavery, fighting to free the slaves, then they were going to be blamed for it. Whatever destruction. There was massive inflation in the South. Now, turning to the South from the northern, those riots, you got to know what inflation is. If you have, say this pen, if you can see it, this pen is $150 million worth of gold, okay? And this phone is $150 million in printed paper. Well, this paper is worth $150 million, okay? But what happens when you print more money? If you print 300 million and you only got 150 million to cover it, then this paper money loses its value. It's now half of what it was. And if you print more money, the value of the dollar goes down because there's no more gold to back it up. That's inflation. Right now, the dollar bill's worth about 37 cents. If you back it up, and we are not on the gold standard anymore. We are on the petrodollar, which means that our money is backed by what they call fiat currency. You can print more money, but it isn't worth anything. That's how we deal with it. That dollar bill that you have in your purse or your wallet is a promissory note that money's going to have value, okay? So if you print more money than you have gold, then that's inflation, because then the money starts to lose its value, and it does lose its value. If you look at this, 10 pounds of bacon was $1.25 in 1860. In 1863, it was $10. So if you go down this list, and you'll see that the currency does not retain the value that it had. It gets more expensive. I mean, think about it now. I mean, bacon. How much is bacon now? You can get a nice, little slab of bacon, a pound of bacon for what, $1.98, $2, somewhere around there. Look at there, it's $10. Tea, expensive. That's inflation. That's what it does to us. The progress of the war between 1861 and 1865, I can tell you, between 1861 and 1863, the South was racking up some victories, but by the end of 1863, it wasn't looking too good because they were running out of money. The England backed out of supporting them, wanted to support them, so they were on their own. And just like sometimes today in Congress, the Confederate Congress was watching the armies lose the battles. Their soldiers had no shoes, and they're sitting there, and no food, and they're sitting there eating peanuts. Their plates are always going to be full, but for the regular soldier, it wasn't. They used to make something called slush for the soldiers in the field. What they would do is they would take a cast iron pan and put it over a fire, and they would fry bacon in it. And then they would take cornmeal and pour that in and mix it all up, and that would be slush. That would be a meal. And a lot of times they didn't even have that. A lot of times they were eating, tree bark and stuff like that because the Southern Army was starving. So it appeared that the Anaconda Plan was actually working. Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia in 1864 did a lot of damage. Atlanta was burned to the ground. They have something called Underground Atlanta. You can go see it. Underneath it, what the city had looked like prior to the Civil War, before it was burned. And he cut this 200-mile swath through Georgia, freeing slaves all along the way and bankrupting the Confederacy. What's not very well documented is what happened to South Carolina, because South Carolina was the first state to secede. So he did the same thing there. A lot of destruction going on there. Is everybody still with me? Everybody still with me? Just say yeah, or snore or something. The 1864 election, President Lincoln ran against George McClellan. And this was the first time that a president ran for office during a major war. But he won. He actually won. He beat McClellan. McClellan wanted to pull the army out of the war, but it didn't happen. There was a peace movement going on in the North called the Copperheads, and they wanted the war to come to an end. At this time, President Lincoln was looking to, was looking to what's going to happen after the war. How should the South be treated? Now, I'm going to give you a link to a documentary that I wrote and I produced and I edited and I narrated from my other channel that I have a true crime channel, and I do documentaries on there. I did the Lincoln assassination on there, and that's important to understand what happened during Reconstruction. But there was this peaceful movement going on, and like I said, Abraham Lincoln was going, okay, the war's coming to an end, hopefully, within the next year, and I want to, how we're going to treat the South. We want to welcome them back into the Union, or we're going to continue to hate them. Well, he wanted to welcome back into the Union. He wanted to heal the nation. The Copperheads came up with like a campaign poster branding Abraham Lincoln as like a king. He suspended habeas corpus during the war, which meant that people could get thrown in jail without any proper cause, which is against the Constitution, but in time of war there are certain powers that are granted. They lampooned the Democrats. All the Copperheads wanted was an end to the war. That's it. The presidential election results in 1864, you'll see that, well, obviously the Confederate states were not involved in the election, but George McClellan only won 2 states. It was basically a landslide, considering that only half the states were in there that voted. And Lincoln won because they understood that the war was coming to an end, and he was partially responsible for that. The final Virginia campaign took place in 1864 to 1865, and basically what happened was the Union Army had grown from 1864 to 1865 to over 500,000 active duty men, including those freed blacks from the South. And the South didn't stand a chance. And Robert E. Lee was surrounded. And he knew it. And General Grant offered him terms of surrender. They respected each other. They really did. And they had actually met one time during the Mexican War from 1846 to 1848. Grant was a young lieutenant. I believe Lee was a captain. But when Lee walked up to the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, he rode in on his horse. Traveler was the name of his horse. And the two men exchanged small talk. And then Grant reminded General Lee why he was there. And they wrote out this instrument of surrender. General Lee wanted to make sure that his men could keep their horses and their small arms because planting season was coming up. And they needed the horses. And General Grant agreed to it. And the war was over on April 9th, 1865. Now, there was still some sporadic fighting. I think the last battle took place in Texas about 3 months after this, but the war was over, essentially. Lee had surrendered. And the Union Army was afraid, General Grant was afraid, that a lot of Confederate Union units would not surrender. They would go into the hills and fight as guerrilla fighters. Well, that didn't happen because of the supply problem. But they did surrender, and the war was over on April 9th, 1865. The casualties on both sides, if we added them together, present casualties are 650,000 Americans died in that war. And it solved basically nothing, although the slaves were free and Grant was considered the great emancipator. I always inform my students that the North won the war militarily, but the South won the war politically. Because we're going to start to see when Reconstruction actually happens, the South is very resistant to the principles that the North was trying to impose on them. In comparison to other wars, the Civil War was the most deadly. This says 620. It was actually 650, more like 650. World War II is 318, World War I 115, Vietnam, and they start getting smaller as you go back further in time. I think a lot of this had to do with the advancement in weaponry. We had the Gatling gun, came out near the end of the war. The Gatling gun was just a stationary machine gun that you cranked the handle and it would fire multiple rounds. Repeating rifles, the Spencer repeating rifles came out. Instead of the muskets being a breech loader, they were, instead of muzzle loader, they were breech loaders, so you loaded it from the back and you could fire all day. The South said, yeah, you could load up on a Wednesday and shoot till Sunday before you had to really reload. So that's what I attribute that to. This John Wilkes Booth was the assassin of Abraham Lincoln, and I will direct you to this documentary that I did. I'll put up a link so you can watch it. It's like I said, it's on my other crime channel, and it explains the reasons why John Wilkes Booth did what he did, and the reasons why he didn't like President Lincoln and what was going on near the end of the war. So I think I'm going to end our lecture on Reconstruction Part 1 at this time. And so I will see you guys Wednesday. We'll do Reconstruction Part 2, where we will discuss that. There'll be a reading assignment up there on the chapter in the book. Ms. Walker, I'll go ahead and send you the link through the email so that you can upload it, or I'll direct you to it on the Moodle page. So I'd like to thank everybody for being here. Thank you very much, and I will see you Wednesday. If there are any questions, please email me, okay?